Number, please. Two words that defined telephone service for generations. The switchboard operator was there when you picked up the receiver, ready to connect your call personally. Then direct dialing arrived, and those words disappeared forever. The boards that once buzzed with activity fell silent. An entire profession simply ceased to exist. Picture a Tuesday morning in 1955. You lift the heavy black receiver in your hallway, wait for the familiar click, and hear those two words come through the earpiece. The operator sits at a massive board stretching 20 feet across, hundreds of brass jacks gleaming under fluorescent lights, thick black cords snaking everywhere. She reaches for a cord with practice speed, plugs it into the correct jack with a satisfying snap, rings your number, and waits to confirm someone answers. In smaller towns, she knows your voice before you speak. In cities, rows of women work identical boards, their voices creating a low hum of constant connection. The whole transaction takes 15 seconds, but she's already reaching for the next blinking light before you finish saying hello. This was the reality of every phone call for decades, a human intermediary who connected America one conversation at a time. Every single phone call required human intervention, no exceptions. Pick up the receiver, wait for the operator, give the number, get connected manually. There was no alternative, no way to bypass this system. The telephone couldn't function without the operator's hands and voice guiding each connection. The switchboards themselves were mechanical marvels, brass jacks arranged in precise grids, each representing a phone line with cords ending in metal plugs that had to be physically inserted to complete a circuit. The boards hummed with electricity, clicked with connections, and required constant, careful attention. Operators worked in shifts around the clock, handling hundreds of calls per hour with speed and accuracy that took months to master. New hires spent weeks learning proper technique, how to hold cords to prevent tangling, how to listen for disconnect signals, how to manage multiple calls simultaneously without losing track. They memorized exchange names and numbers for their territories. They knew which lines belonged to doctors, fire stations, and businesses that needed priority service during emergencies. They maintained mental maps of their communities, connecting people faster than any machine could have managed. The job required perfect diction, infinite patience, and the ability to stay calm during emergencies while connecting life or death calls. Operators connected distressed mothers to pediatricians at 3 a.m., helped coordinate responses during fires and floods, and sometimes stayed on the line with callers in crisis until help arrived. By the 1920s, major cities employed thousands of operators. New York alone had over 10,000 women working the boards at peak hours. These vast rooms of switchboards required extraordinary coordination, with supervisors patrolling the aisles, monitoring call volumes, and reassigning operators as demand shifted throughout the day. Each operator could handle about 200 to 300 calls per hour, but every call required individual attention and manual connection. There was no automation, no shortcuts, just skilled women working as quickly as their hands and voices would allow. Phone companies paid decent wages for the era. It was respectable work that attracted educated women who needed steady employment. For many women with high school educations, becoming an operator offered financial independence, stable hours, and social standing that few other jobs provided. But the labor costs were enormous and growing. Every new phone line meant more potential calls, which meant more operators needed. As telephone adoption expanded, companies faced an impossible equation: how to meet increasing demand without hiring every working woman in America. Companies realized early that if telephone service was ever going to reach mass market, they had to eliminate the human bottleneck. The search for automation wasn't just about cost-cutting, it was about scaling a system that simply couldn't grow indefinitely with human operators at its center. The perfect storm that would ultimately eliminate switchboard operators began brewing decades before the profession disappeared. First, automatic switching technology matured. Alman Stroger's 1891 invention, reportedly created because he suspected a switchboard operator of directing his business calls to a competitor, finally became reliable and cost-effective by the 1920s. Second, World War II created severe labor shortages. Phone companies couldn't find enough operators to meet wartime communication demands. With women needed in defense factories and military support roles, telephone companies struggled to staff switchboards when call volumes were at historic highs. This crisis accelerated the push toward automation. Third, customer resistance gradually weakened. Younger users adapted to dialing their own calls, while older customers who preferred operators aged in out of the market. What seemed unnatural and complicated to one generation became second nature to the next. Fourth, long-distance automation arrived. Direct distance dialing launched in 1951, eliminating operators from the most profitable calls. When customers could dial someone 3 states away without assistance, the economic justification for maintaining human operators for local calls became increasingly difficult to defend. The combination was unstoppable. Technology improved, labor became scarce, and economics demanded change. The writing was on the wall for an entire profession, though few realized how quickly it would disappear. Conversion happened city by city, exchange by exchange, starting in the 1940s and accelerating through the 1960s. Each time a community switched to direct dialing, notices went out explaining the new system, often accompanied by instructional films and demonstrations. By 1960, most local calls were direct dial. By 1970, long distance was mostly automated. By 1980, operators handled only specialized services like person-to-person calls, collect calls, and emergency assistance. The occupation that had employed hundreds of thousands was reduced to a fraction of its former size. The massive switching rooms were dismantled piece by piece. Boards that once employed hundreds now sat empty and dark. The buildings that housed them, often architectural landmarks in town centers, were repurposed or demolished. The physical infrastructure of human-mediated communication disappeared from the American landscape. Operators who left or retired weren't replaced. Training programs shut down. The skills became obsolete almost overnight. Women who had spent decades developing expertise found themselves with specialized abilities no longer needed in a world of rotary dials and automated switches. What had been one of the largest female occupations in America, over 350,000 jobs at peak, simply vanished. Some operators transitioned to other roles within telephone companies, but most had to find entirely new careers, often at lower wages and with less security. The operator wasn't just a connection service. She was often the first voice you heard in an emergency, calm and competent when you needed help most. Before 911 systems existed, the operator was who you called when your house was on fire or your child stopped breathing. She knew which doctors were on call, which neighbors could help, which emergencies required police versus fire response. In small towns, she knew everyone's voice, their families, their routines. She was part of the social fabric, not just the phone system. She knew that the elderly widow on Oak Street needed checking on if she didn't answer by the 3rd ring. She knew which teenagers were dating against their parents' wishes. She knew when to pretend she hadn't overheard a sensitive conversation. There was something reassuring about human confirmation that your call went through, that someone was listening, that you weren't alone on the line. When connections failed, you didn't get cold dial tones or automated messages. You got a person working actively to solve your problem, to reconnect you, to find an alternative. The personal touch disappeared forever. No more, "Hold on, honey, let me try that number again," or "I think they stepped out. Want me to try later?" No more local knowledge. No more human judgment applied to each connection. Efficiency replaced empathy. Automation replaced attention. What replaced it offered efficiency and cost savings, but at the cost of the last human checkpoint in our most intimate conversations. The operator had been a guardian of community standards, a gatekeeper who kept systems functioning, and sometimes the only witness to life's most dramatic moments: births announced, deaths revealed, romances kindled, and arguments ended. If you remember those 2 words, number please, you remember a time when every phone call began with a human voice. A time when reaching out to another person always involved at least briefly connecting with a third. A time when communications had a human buffer that's now completely absent. You remember the slight pause while she found your number, the click of the connection, the way she'd say "go ahead" when your party answered. You remember the cadence of these exchanges, the small rituals that preceded every important conversation of your life. You remember party lines where she'd remind you others were listening, or how she'd stay on during emergencies to help coordinate rescue efforts. You remember when she'd break into calls to deliver urgent messages. Your mother needs you to come home right away, serving as the human network that held communities together before instant messaging and cell phones. Those details don't fade because they were part of the rhythm of daily life, as familiar as the sound of your own front door closing. They were woven into the experience of human connection itself, the small interactions that preceded the important ones, the voices that facilitated our most necessary communications. The operator's voice was the sound of connection itself, and when it disappeared, something fundamental about communication changed forever. We gained direct control over our calls, but lost the human intermediary who had been part of American life for generations. If this brought back the memory of lifting that receiver and waiting for those familiar words, go ahead and like this video. What do you remember about calling through an operator? Did you know her name? Did she know yours? What was different in your town? Those personal details are the part we can't research. That's the part only you know, and it matters more than you might think. These shared memories are how we piece together our collective past, how we understand what changed and what we lost along the way. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring how the ordinary details of American life quietly changed and what we lost when they did.